Good morning, everybody. My name's Curtis Teel. I'm our Twinsburg, Macedonia campus minister. Welcome if you're here hanging out with us this morning. Welcome if you're hanging out with us online at mochurch.tv. Go ahead and grab your Bibles and open up to Matthew chapter 9. If you don't have a Bible that you feel like you can read and understand, grab one from the end of the row, pass it down. We're going to be on page 789 when we get there here in just a little bit. If you're online with us, go ahead and open up a new web page. You go to BibleGateway.com. We'll be using the NIV version today in Matthew chapter 9. Now, round of applause. We're closing out our momentum at the movie series this morning. By round of applause, how many of you saw the movie Dunkirk? All right. Okay. Hold on. No, this is okay. This is good. Look, I don't know if it's good or not, But here's the deal. This movie is awesome, okay? And I don't say that really about movies, okay? I went and so this movie just last week left theaters. Like it's no longer in theaters, so you'd have to go and you would have had to go to the theaters, but it's now out on Redbox, and soon it'll be out on DVD. You can go rent it, and this movie is worth the red box. This movie is good. Here's the deal. I went and saw it one time because I knew it was a potential for momentum at the movies, and I don't go. I almost went and saw it twice just because I wanted to. And here's the deal. I don't go see movies for the first time in the movie theaters. This movie is good. It is worth checking out. So my hope is that at the end of today, maybe I will inspire you to be willing to spend the $1.67 it takes to rent it at Redbox and go home and Redbox it sometime this week. So this movie tells the story. It tells the true story that takes place over the days of May 26th through June 4th of 1940. So about a week and a half time period. And at the very outset of the movie, we see a bunch of scenes that we're going to talk about this morning are touched on in the trailer. And at the very beginning of the movie, though, you meet who could be, and I say could be because there's not really a main character in the story, but you meet who could be considered the main character in the story, kind of the main protagonist. And here's the deal. In the movie, you don't even learn his name. You don't even learn this guy's name. I know his name because I went and IMDb'd and found out, in the script, he was referred to as Tommy. But in the movie, you never hear him referred to. You don't learn his name. At the very beginning of the movie, this soldier, Tommy, is running with a bunch of other British soldiers back away from German forces and trying to get back behind friendly lines of the British Army. And they're being pushed back at in every possible facet. The Allied forces are losing the war in France. And they have been now pushed back to just the beaches of Dunkirk, Germany. And at the beginning of the movie, when he's running away, German planes are flying over the city of Dunkirk, and they're dropping propaganda all over the city for the remaining British soldiers who are there to see and try and deter them away from fighting the war. In the movie, they picture the propaganda like this. I've got a picture for you. Well, this is the one in an actual museum. So this is actually a historical propaganda. This is what they actually dropped in the streets of Dunkirk, France, to try and deter the soldiers away. Go to the movie picture real quick, and then we'll come back to this one. I know I mixed them up first service. So in the movie, you picture all these papers are flying around, and he picks one up, and it says, it's very clearly, you can tell what it says is, "We've surrounded you." Here's you, here's us, surrender so that you can survive. Now, this was something that they actually did. The Germans actually did this in the war. Go back to that other picture, Corey. And so in here, this is what they actually dropped. This is in a historical museum for World War II, trying to show what happened here at the city of Dunkirk. And down here at the bottom, it says this. It says, "Look at this map. Look at this map. It gives your true situation. Your troops are entirely surrounded. Stop fighting. Put down your arms." Wow. That's intense. And then they're dropping this all around to try and discourage them from continuing to fight. And so this movie tells the true story of 400,000, hear that, 400,000 Allied soldiers, mostly British soldiers, who get trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, France. German forces had literally surrounded the entire Allied army and had pushed them back to where now their backs were up against the sea and they were facing annihilation from the German army. They were either facing death by sea, or death by the German Air Force, or death by the German army. Literally, that was all they had left. And when that has happened, when they find themselves with their backs up against the wall, pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk, Winston Churchill puts into action what's now known as Operation Dynamo. Operation Dynamo, which was an evacuation, a retreat that had the high hopes, get this, 400,000 soldiers trapped on the beach. And when he puts into effect Operation Dynamo, it had the high hopes of being able to rescue 30,000. Like, man, that's a bleak situation, right? Like, that's a desperate situation. You got 400,000 men trapped on this beach, and you have the high hopes of rescuing 30,000 of them. And the reason why they only figured they'd be able to rescue 30,000 was that was the British figured that would be all they'd be able to rescue before the German Navy, before German forces, the Air Forces, the Army, and the Navy cut them off from being able to get back in to Dunkirk. And so what happens is the British Navy sends destroyers, big Navy ships, over from England to get to Dunkirk, France, which was only somewhere between like 20 and 40 miles that they had to travel. So they're pretty close. So they send these destroyers, and every time the British Navy sends these destroyers to try and pick up these soldiers to rescue them, the German Air Force comes in with bombers and sinks the destroyers. And there's a couple of times in the movies where destroyers actually make it in to the beaches of Dunkirk. And you see thousands of soldiers load down the ship, and you begin to get this like sense of hope. You see it in the trailer. They go in and they even begin to eat, and they laugh together because they think, hey, we're going to get there. We're going to make it. Now, all of a sudden, a German sub shows up, torpedoes, and many of those men get trapped on the boat and end up eventually drowning. And there's very little dialogue in the movie. In fact, that's what I think is probably one of the coolest things about it. There's very little dialogue in the movie, but there are some really intense lines that I think help build the picture for what these soldiers were facing, what they were up against. There's a Commander Bolton and his captain, Captain Winnett. We see him in the trailer. And at one point in time, Captain Bolton, he's standing on the beaches of Dunkirk, and he's looking out into the ocean. And he says to his captain that's standing there, he says, "You can almost see it from here." And the captain says, "What?" And the commander simply says back, "Home." And he pauses for a little bit, and then he says to his captain, "But seeing home doesn't help us get there, Captain." And it's like, man, like for me, that was the moment in the movie where I understood the gravity of their situation, with how desperate of a situation this was. Like, it's great. It's great that we can see home. It's great that we can see where the hope is, but it does us absolutely no good if we're not able to get there. It's great that we can practically see it, but what good is the hope if I can't get there? What good is the hope if I've got no one to show me how to get there? And for us, we can relate to that. Now, although like me, personally, and I think probably many of us in the room, for us personally, nothing that we've experienced probably is anything like what these soldiers experienced trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, or what many of our veterans who are probably sitting in here this morning have experienced when you've been out on the battlefield for our freedom. But we can relate to the idea of feeling like hope is just out of reach, right? Like it's there, like I can see it, there's ideas of it. I can almost see it, but I've got no idea from how to even get there. And we can relate to the idea of hope being just out of reach because we've felt that, right? Like, is there help for this loneliness? Like, is there hope for this loneliness, for this depression that just keeps setting in on me? And I hear rumors of hope, but I have no idea how to get there, right? Is there really healing for my marriage? Is there hope for my marriage? Is there forgiveness for my family and that deep wound that was put there so many years ago? Is there hope for my finances that I could actually get these under control? Is there hope for raising my kids? Is there hope for getting to adulthood? Like I see it. I can almost see it. But what good does that do me if I've got no idea how to get there? And that's a lot of what these soldiers were facing trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. And so the British Navy continually sends destroyers to try and evacuate soldiers. And every time one shows up, it brings some hope. You can see it on the faces of the men who are on the beaches. But then every destroyer that gets sent gets destroyed. And one of probably the darkest scenes of the movie is after another bombing raid by the German Air Force. After a destroyer comes in, German planes come in, they bomb, sink the destroyer. Probably the darkest scene of the movie is one British soldier. He just simply takes off his weapon and his canteen, but still loaded down in all of his gear, and he just walks out into the water. And it's like, well, he's either going to swim or he's just simply given up fighting. And my impression of the situation was he just had given up fighting. You see, because with every destroyer that showed up and it got destroyed, a big piece of hope got destroyed with it. And we know this because we felt it. When hope continually gets destroyed, or when hope continually gets destroyed, sooner or later, you stop fighting. Right? When our hope keeps getting destroyed, you stop fighting. It's too many of us sitting in this room this morning have friends and family members that we love whose hope kept getting destroyed and they stopped fighting. And so the question becomes, who's going to be the one to show up to give them the hope? Who's going to bring them the hope while they're trapped on this beach? There are so many that are sitting there, they're needing it, they can almost see it. But it does them no good if there's not someone to bring it to them. Man, and this story reminds me so much of a little piece of wisdom and a little quick story that happens in Matthew chapter 9. Jesus is hanging out and he's been teaching a bunch of people. He's been traveling from city to city. And he drops this little bit of wisdom on us that I want to read and kind of just break down this morning. It goes like this, starting in Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 35. If you're in the paperback house Bibles, you got to flip one page over from the page I told you to go to because I wanted to keep the verse a secret, So flip over to page 790, and the story goes just like this. Jesus went through all the towns and the villages. He was teaching in their synagogues, which is like their churches, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. He's bringing hope, he's bringing joy, he's bringing peace. So verse 36, so when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So then verse 37, so then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. I want to break down these things real quick. So verse 35, we go back to verse 35. It says, Jesus went through the towns teaching. We went through the towns and all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, teaching in their churches. So he's going around and he's beginning to teach everybody, it says, about the kingdom. Like, well, what is that? Well, see, the people group that Jesus is specifically teaching to here in this story had been taught for years, for hundreds of years, maybe even longer than that one day God was going to send to them what they called a Messiah. Somebody that was going to come and establish a kingdom, like be a king and set up a kingdom that would never end. And for them, they were looking for a physical king to come and set up a physical kingdom. But God was working on something bigger. He's working on a spiritual kingdom. A spiritual kingdom, like in the aspect of he's going to send Jesus, and Jesus is going to show us what it really looks like to love God and love people. And like to really love God, what that really looks like when we're really doing our best at loving God is we're loving people. We're putting each other's needs ahead of our own. We're taking care of one another, which is why he goes and he's healing every disease and sickness, because he's Jesus, he's able to do that, and he's taking care of others. All right, he's putting others' needs ahead of his own, and that's what Jesus is trying to get us to grasp. And because of that, because we're living in such a way where we're putting others' needs, we're putting each other ahead of ourselves, we then can experience in life a life of hope and joy and peace and patience and kindness and understanding. Like we can experience that thing. And here's the deal, people are drawn to that, right? Don't you want some hope in your life? Wouldn't you like some peace in your life, right? And so people are naturally drawn to that. And so Jesus is teaching about that, and he's showing it. He's living it out. He's delivering hope to them. They see the hope, and so they begin to follow him. And so he starts to amass a crowd. He starts to amass a following, and people begin to follow Jesus. And then this is the verse that I really want to hone in on this morning. Because so what happens is, so he's teaching, he begins to amass a crowd, he's going from town to town, going from village to village, and at some point in time, he turns around and he looks at the crowd. When he saw the crowds, it says he had compassion on them. Now here's the deal. So Jesus is going, he's teaching, he turns around, he looks at the crowd, it says he had compassion on them. We read that word compassion, and if you're anything like me, you think Jesus looks at the crowd and he goes, "Aw." Right? Like he had compassion on them. Like, "Oh, that's so nice. Jesus had compassion on them. Oh, like that's fun. It's fun. You guys want to do that with me? Oh, yeah, see? There we go. You're like, this is so weird. But he looks at him and he says he has compassion. Now, here's the deal. This word, and I've talked about this word before, this word in its original language, like before it was translated, the word actually literally means guts. He turns around, he looks at it, and the idea is Jesus looks at the crowd and he gets this pit in his stomach. It's this mix of emotion. It's this sadness, but there's also like a level of anger there where he looks at him and he goes, "Man, this isn't right." He gets this pit in his stomach of like, this isn't good. Well, why does he feel that? Why does he feel that compassion on them? Well, it says because they were harassed and helpless. They were like sheep without a shepherd. They were like people being stuck on a beach and they just kept getting bombed. People just wouldn't leave them alone. There was no hope. And so Jesus, it says he feels compassion on them. And I just don't feel like this word really conveys to us what's actually being said here. So I want to submit to you a new word this morning. I want to submit a word for the English language. We're going to use the word companger. Right? Like a mix of sadness and anger. You think that'll catch on? Sure, no, that's all right. That's fine. I'll use it. I'll use it with my daughter. When my oldest daughter starts picking on my youngest daughter, say, "Hadley, you're really making me compangry right now." And I think she'll get the picture. Like I'm sad because she's picking on her, but I'm angry because she's picking on her, But that's the idea here. It is Jesus feels compassion. He gets sad because he sees their sin, and he sees the way the sin is stealing their hope. And he sees how they don't have that hope. And then he gets angry kind of at their situation that they just keep getting harassed. See, for them, in this specific situation, the religious leaders kept stealing the hope from them. And so it says he feels compassion on them. And Jesus feeling this compassion then says, verse 37, where he says this. He says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers out into his harvest field." For us, what Jesus is saying this morning is that there are plenty of people out there who need hope, and there are not a lot of people willing to take it to them. There are a lot of people out there that need that hope, but there are not a lot of people willing to take that to them. There are a lot of people out there that don't know that God loves them. And there needs to be someone to take that message to them. They need to know that God loves them, that God's not mad at them, that God's not just wanting to judge them, that God actually chose them. And there's a lot of people that don't know that. So ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers out into the harvest field. There are a lot of people who are hopeless. They're ready to follow Jesus, but it's not enough. Maybe they could even just almost see it, but it does them no good if there's not someone to bring them to it. When I was about 9 years old, we moved for the very first time. We were moving from a house in Glen Burnie, Maryland, about 10 minutes maybe down the road into Linthicum, Maryland. And when you're 9 years old, you don't feel like the stress of what it's like to have to pack everything up in the house, load it into boxes, and then take it down and unpack it at the new house. For me as a 9-year-old boy, I just see boxes everywhere, which translates into forts everywhere, throughout the house. But eventually, all those boxes get loaded down with stuff. And it was time to begin loading up the truck. And there are boxes, just boxes everywhere. And people began showing up from my parents, from our church and from my parents' workplace and our neighbors. And at first, there wasn't very many. And it just felt like we were going to be there forever. As people were one at a time carrying a box out, setting in the truck, coming back in, grabbing one box. But people just kept showing up. And eventually, enough people showed up that they didn't have to carry boxes individually anymore, and they just formed this giant human chain where they could lift up the box and kind of hand to the next person, box, hand to the next person. And the people packing and the people in the truck couldn't keep up. And they ended up loading and unloading the truck in less than 3 hours. It was amazing. And it illustrates the principle, honestly, kind of essentially what Jesus is getting at here, that many hands make light work. Jesus is saying we need more hands to help deliver the story, the hope of Jesus. That there are lots of people who need to hear this story. That there are people out there, figuratively, metaphorically, stuck on their own Dunkirk beaches, and there's not a whole lot of people bringing the hope to them to help rescue them off of it. And so Jesus says, ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers out into his harvest field. Bottom line, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you say, I am a Christian, you are in the life-saving business. Jesus said, man, I'm putting the call out. In the movie, the Germans continue to come in and they continue to bomb and raid the big naval destroyers. And so the Royal Navy is forced to activate the civilian boats. And many of the civilians that own the civilian boats willingly volunteered to go with their boats to Dunkirk to rescue the soldiers that they could. And in less than a 3-period day, the Royal Navy was able to put together a fleet of over 800 private boats, private crafts and ships. And in the movie, we follow this part of the story through a man named Mr. Dawson. We have a picture for you. He's the private boat owner that the movie follows, and he brings his son, Peter, along with him. And when they go to set out, Peter unties them from the dock and they begin kind of heading out in the boat, his son asks, where are we going? And Mr. Dawson simply says back, the call went out, we have to go to Dunkirk. The call went out, meaning they need us to go rescue, meaning the hope is gone. We are now the ones that can bring this hope. Now, we're eventually going to come back to this scene because I think this is probably my favorite scene of the whole movie. But Peter and his dad, that's all the conversation they had. Because the call went out. We have to go. It's now on us. Like the hope's not going to get there if it's not for us. And so these private boats, these private citizens, set out in their own boats to go and deliver the hope because otherwise it's not going to happen. Now, where I think this kind of marries up for us with what Jesus is teaching here is really what I think Jesus is saying to us here is use what you can to help rescue who you can. Use what you can to help rescue who you can. The call went out. We have to go. Now this is really where the rubber begins to meet the road for you when you become a follower of Jesus. When you become a Christian. Is how much you understand, this is where it shows like how much you understand about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Because if you are a follower of Jesus, you're a Christian, you are in the life-saving business. Your job is now to go and deliver that hope. Now while they're en route from England to Dunkirk for the first time, they pick up a soldier whose boat had capsized, and you see it in the trailer. While the soldier's boat was capsized while he was escaping Dunkirk. And so he recognizes that once they're in the boat and they're heading in the wrong direction, the soldier realizes, hey, wait, I thought you were taking me back to England. You're actually taking me to Dunkirk. What are you doing? Like, do you realize how bad it is there? And Mr. Dawson and the soldier, they get in kind of this back and forth argument. And eventually the soldier says to Mr. Dawson, you're weekend sailors, not the bloody Navy. You should be at home. Man, and so often, I think that's the way we feel about the task of helping kind of help rescue people by telling people the story about Jesus. It's like, man, let's leave that to the professionals. I'm not a bloody minister. Like what am I supposed to do with that? But our call is to be like Mr. Dawson. Our call is to be like his son Peter. He says, man, the call went out. We have to go. And then the last guy we're introduced to is a friend of Peter's named George. I've got a picture for you of what George looks like in the movie. And George is probably my favorite character in the movie simply for this scene. So shortly after they have that, Peter and Mr. Dawson have that conversation of where we're going, and Mr. Dawson's like, the calls went out, we've got to go to Dunkirk. George also hops onto the boat at the last second as it's going away from the dock. And Mr. Dawson isn't really happy about George jumping on because Mr. Dawson's not George's dad. Like, George, you're not really supposed to be here. Do you even understand what you just jumped into? And he says, do you know where we're headed, George? And George simply says back, France, because like he had just heard the commander say it. Like he kind of said it back kind of like snarky, like, France, I just heard you talk about this. And so as they're putting on, and Mr. Dawson corrects him, and he says, no, we're headed to war, George. And you'd think that that's going to like begin to change his mind. You'd think that'd begin to change his facial expression as he's looking there. But he simply says back to Mr. Dawson, I'll be useful. And that's where the conversation ends. Even though George had no idea really what he had just signed on, he did not have a full grasp of where he was headed or what he was headed into, George knew that whatever it was and wherever it was, he would be useful. That regardless of the situation, he was going to find a way to help, to use what he had to help rescue who he could. Now here's kind of like the thing for us. All of us have different talents. We got different talents, we got different passions, we got different abilities. Some of us are naturally good at things. Some of us have a craft that we've honed over our entire lives just to finally like get good at. We've fine-tuned and we've worked on. And all of us have differing of those things. And a guy named Paul writes a letter to the church in Rome, and he says something that I think is very practical for us and leans on what Jesus is teaching in that story. It says this in Romans 12, verses 6 through 8. A guy named Paul writes, and he says, we all have different gifts, right? We've all got different abilities, we've got different talents, we've got different passions, we've got different things that we're good at according to the grace given to each of us. So if your gift is prophesying, we're going to talk about this. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. He goes on. He says, if it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, then do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, then do it cheerfully. So all of these things, all of our passions, all of our talents, they're all meant for us to use to point people back to the hope of Jesus. That's what they're meant for. That's what the talent that you've been given, that thing that you're really good at, or that thing, that craft that you've honed. And sometimes it takes some creative brain power to figure out how to get those two to marry up. But Paul kind of begins to hint in the direction of how we can do those things. He says, like some of you, you're good at prophesying. And for them, that would have meant like preaching. It would have meant singing. It could have meant singing, which I'm great at. And so I make sure to use that talent all the time for Jesus. I'm not great for singing. But he says, so if it's prophesying, then use it for God. He says, if it's serving people, like some of you, you just got the talent, you've just got the ability to serve people, to show the love of Jesus in a very practical way. And so he says, so do that. He says, some of you, you've got the ability to teach, so teach. Some of you, you've got the ability to encourage. Some of you just have a natural ability to walk in a room and encourage somebody. When they just feel deep and in a dark, stuck pit, you've just got some way of just bringing them out of it and helping them feel hope when they felt like there was no hope. Paul says, man, some of you, if your talent's giving, some of you, you've just got the ability to make money so that you can help people, help lift them out. You can serve people so that practical needs can be met within the community. He says, man, some of you, you've got the gift of mercy. Some of you, you just have the ability to show mercy. You've got a way to be patient and kind to people who are difficult to be patient and kind to. And so Paul says, do it cheerfully. The bottom line, regardless of who you are, what your story is, what your talent is, you can be useful. You can be useful. The question is, are you going to use it, or are you just going to stay tied to the dock? And there's so many of you who are sitting in here this morning who are already being useful, who are pitching in with what you can for who you can. There's a team of Renee Bolton and many other unleashed student volunteers who go out and every week they use their minivans, their SUVs, their cars to go to kids' houses all over Garfield Heights and a little beyond to help pick students up to bring to our unleashed student ministry for 6th to 12th graders on Sunday afternoon. literally being like the boats that have shown up on these like individual students' beaches to rescue them off of their own quote-unquote Dunkirk beach. We've got students who show up here every Friday, as well as some of you adults who take your lunch break, who show up to help set up this room so that on Sunday morning we have a space where we can deliver a story of hope and that God loves you deeply regardless of what your story is. We've got people like Peggy Anderson who goes to our TM campus. She came to me one time and she said, Curtis, I want to serve, but I don't really know like what to do. You said I have a talent, like I like to be crafty. I'm crafty. And I was like, Beastie Boys? And she said, I like to be crafty. And so like we worked on a couple different things. Now what she does is she hand makes and writes cards to anybody at our TM campus who fills out a Connect card for the first time, who says, man, thanks for showing up on Sunday morning. We noticed you. We're glad you're here. We hope that you'll come back. And as small as a boat as that may seem, man, I've heard time after time after time what a big difference that's made to help rescue somebody. Man, if you're a host of a Mo group, I know that it's easy to fall in the rut of feeling like opening your home to a group of 6 to 12 people week after week after week isn't making a difference. Or if you go to a Mo group, I know it can be easy to fall into a rut to feel like your attendance there isn't making a difference. But man, I've seen Mo groups be the catalyst for marriages begin to find healing, for families to begin to find forgiveness over a deep wound that's been had in the family. I've seen Mo groups be the catalyst of laughter and encouragement to show up at just the right time after a tough loss in the family or sickness in the family. You are literally being those lifeboats that show up on people's Dunkirk beaches. You are being those lifeboats by doing that. So you get the picture. The question is, are you going to use what you have to help rescue who you can, or do you just stay tied to the dock? And here's the deal. If you're not a Christian, if you're not a follower of Jesus, man, I'm super glad that you're here this morning. But this message, you kind of get to like skirt around this message. Like you don't have to do what I'm saying, but you are more than welcome to. Momentum is a place where you can belong here before you believe like we do, where you can continue to investigate. Man, I don't know that I buy into all this about Jesus and God yet. You are still more than welcome to serve alongside of us. In fact, we really encourage you to do so. But really, I think where the punchiness of this message comes in to those of us who say, yeah, I am a follower of Jesus. I am a Christian. So how can I be useful? Like, what can I do? Well, the first thing that I want to challenge you to do is what Jesus challenges you to do in verse 38, where he says, pray. Pray. But here's what I want you to pray. Because he says, pray that God will send workers into the harvest field. But man, so often we'll use that as an excuse to not go ourselves. So here's what I want you to pray. I want you to take the prayer to the next level. I want you to pray this. God, what have you given me that I'm not, but should be, using for you? God, what have you given me that I'm not, but should be, using for you? And then, God, help me use it. God, help me use it. Help me put this into practice. Help me put this into practice. God, what is it that you've given me that I'm not, but should be using for you? The second thing I want you to kind of sit down and start thinking through is I want you to know your why. I mean, sometimes one of the best things that you can do is just kind of share your story about why you follow Jesus. And if you don't know that, now's a good time to start thinking through why. And for me, man, I have found real practicality in just the simple statement of, man, Jesus' wisdom has made my life better, not easier. Jesus' wisdom has made my life better and is making me better at life. As I continue to follow Jesus, I feel like I'm getting better at life. Not always easier, but better. As I continue to implement his wisdom, I feel like my finances are getting better. As I continue to implement his wisdom, I'm getting to be a better husband. As I'm continuing to implement his wisdom, I'm beginning to be a better dad. Man, and those are the things that I want to kill at. At the end of I'd love to be able to say, man, I was a killer husband and I was a killer dad. And the minister stuff, that'll follow. And so you got to know your why. I can point to a clear before and I can point to an after, and the after's better. So you got to know your why. And then the last thing I want to challenge you to do is consider playing a part. playing a part in helping introduce people to Jesus. Sometimes that's telling your why story to the people you work with, to your neighbors, inviting them over to parties or football parties that you have. But man, another super easy way is to help pull off one of our Sunday morning services. And I know this goes way beyond just our Sunday morning service, but if you're looking for a very practical way to jump in, this is how. This is a way you could begin to help introduce people to Jesus. By being on the tech team, by being in Mo Kids, being a greeter, help serve communion. Those things may seem like small boats, but man, we hear all the time about how people love coming here to get introduced to Jesus. And so that's just a simple, practical way that you could jump in. But I know it goes beyond this as well. Some of you need to seriously be considering becoming a foster parent. Some of you need to seriously be considering getting more heavily involved in your student school. Or maybe just a school that's in your backyard. Maybe there's not students there at all, but maybe you need to be more invested in your local school. Some of you, and I fully believe this, some of you sitting in this room need to be considering going into full-time ministry. Because there are plenty of people out there that need that hope delivered, and there's not a lot of people willing to go. So the last thing I want to tell you about the movie is they continually refer to this Operation Dynamo, this Dunkirk, as a miracle. That's the word that pops up a couple different times in the film. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And even in actual documentaries, people talk about this thing being a miracle. And there's so much cool stuff I wish I could share, but we've got to get out of here. So Hitler had Dunkirk completely surrounded, right? I mean, just absolutely completely surrounded. His infantry, his tanks, they were all right there. The Air Force was in. They were able to bomb. And for whatever reason, Hitler decided to stop his advance. He could have just annihilated them. And for whatever reason, he just stopped. And it baffles generals. And they were confused. They're like, I don't know why this is happening, but hey, let's get everybody out, you know? And so after the war was over, they went in, and they began to collect all kinds of intelligence, all kinds of papers, all kinds of letters, some of which were in Hitler's own handwriting. And in some of these letters contained Hitler's thoughts as to why he didn't advance and finish off the soldiers stuck in Dunkirk. And it turns out that Hitler believed that now that the Allied army, had seen the Germans' power and might, that once they escaped out of France, they wouldn't dare come back. Yeah, but they did come back, didn't they? And this time they brought some friends. And that made all the difference in the world. So here's what I want you to hear from that this morning. Don't be the person that gets rescued, that finds that life of hope and joy and peace that Jesus offers, but then doesn't go back to help rescue the others stuck on the beach. Man, the call's gone out. I know we've got a hesitation to back out. I know we've got a hesitation to say, man, let's leave it to someone else. I've been hurt by the church. But man, don't let that be your excuse to keep you from mission. So they used 800 private boats, and over a period of almost 8 days, instead of being able to rescue the high hopes of 30,000, they were able to rescue 330,000 Allied soldiers. Man, would you jump in if you knew that your boat, what you had, could be the difference between 30,000 and 300,000? Let's pray. God, we love you. God, thanks for loving us. God, help us to see what it is that you've given us that we're not, but should be using for you. God, it does feel like a tall order to be out there, and it feels kind of like an overwhelming thing of knowing, man, when's the right time to say, should I invite them? Should I just kind of leave it alone? And God, I just ask for your wisdom on that. God, give us opportunities. Give us clear-cut opportunities and help us to see when you've given opportunities to help deliver that hope to people. God, help us, give us the eyes to be able to notice when someone is in that desperation so that we could give them that hope that you have to offer. God, thank you so much just for your Son, for your love that you have for us. It's in your Son's holy and awesome name we pray. Amen.